I'm 64 years old now, a wilderness survival instructor living in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. And for 38 years, I've been keeping a secret that cost me my marriage, my career, and nearly my sanity. In the winter of 1986, I found him dying in a ravine near my property. A massive creature, over 8 feet tall, his leg shattered from a fall, infection spreading through his body. I should have called someone. I should have documented it, taken photos, proven to the world that Bigfoot was real. Instead, I brought him to my barn and saved his life. His name is, well, I call him Brother. We spent 6 weeks together that winter, and when he was strong enough, he disappeared back into the wilderness. I thought I'd never see him again. But 3 weeks ago, on a freezing November night, he came back. And he wasn't alone. What he brought with him, what he was asking me to do, has forced me to break 38 years of silence. This is the story of an impossible friendship, a debt repaid, and the choice that will either save a dying species or destroy the last of them forever. January 1986. I was 26 years old, running a wilderness survival school out of my property in the North Cascades, about 40 miles from the nearest town. I'd bought the land cheap 2 years earlier, 200 acres of forest, a small cabin, and a barn I'd converted into a workshop and teaching space. I taught weekend courses on survival skills, took hunting groups into the backcountry, and spent the rest of my time alone with my books and my solitude. I preferred it that way. People said I was antisocial, but the truth was, I just understood the forest better than I understood civilization. On January 11th, the worst ice storm in a decade hit western Washington. Trees came down across the entire region, power lines snapped, and the temperature dropped to 5 degrees. And somewhere in that frozen hell, a creature that shouldn't exist took a fall that would change both our lives forever. I was in my cabin when the storm hit, reading a survival manual by kerosene lamp because I'd lost power around 3 p.m. The wind screamed through the valley like nothing I'd ever heard, and every few minutes I'd hear the crack of a tree giving way somewhere in the darkness, followed by the crash of impact. Each one made me flinch. Those were old-growth cedars and Douglas firs out there, some of them 200 years old, snapping like kindling under the weight of the ice. I kept the fire going and tried to sleep, but the sound of the forest dying kept me awake most of the night. By morning, my property looked like a war zone. Trees were down everywhere, some blocking the road completely, others leaning at dangerous angles, waiting to finish falling. The ice coating everything made the world look beautiful and deadly at the same time. Every branch encased in crystal, the sunlight turning it all into something that belonged in a fairy tale. But I knew what that beauty meant. Animals were dying out there, trapped under fallen timber, unable to find food under the ice. I spent that first day just clearing enough space around the cabin to function, cutting up downed trees for firewood, checking that the barn hadn't been crushed. The second day, I started checking my property lines. It was something I did after any major storm, looking for damage, hazards, anything that needed attention before I could safely bring groups out here again. I worked methodically, starting from the cabin and spiraling outward, marking dangerous trees, noting where I'd need to do cleanup. The temperature had stayed below freezing, and every step required careful attention. One slip on that ice, and I could break an ankle out here with no way to call for help. It was around 2 p.m. when I heard it. I'd reached the eastern edge of my property, where the land drops off sharply into a ravine about 40 feet deep. And from somewhere down in that ravine, I heard a sound that made me stop walking. Low, rhythmic, pained. My first thought was injured elk, maybe trapped under a fallen tree. But there was something about the cadence of it, something deliberate, almost like speech, like someone trying to communicate through waves of pain. I stood at the edge of that ravine for a long time, listening, trying to convince myself to walk away. This was exactly the kind of situation I warned my students about. Never go down into dangerous terrain alone. Never try a rescue without backup. Never put yourself at risk for an animal that's probably going to die anyway. I had rope in my pack, basic first aid supplies, but nothing that would help me if I got injured trying to get down there. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to go back to the cabin, wait until the roads cleared, and come back with help if the animal was still alive. But I also knew that by the time I got back with help, whatever was down there would be dead. And I'd spent my entire adult life teaching people that survival isn't just about keeping yourself alive. It's about making hard choices when someone or something needs you. I'd built my entire philosophy around the idea that we have a responsibility to the wilderness and everything in it. So I checked my rope, checked my gear, and started working my way down into that frozen ravine. I had no idea I was about to find something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the world. I just knew something was suffering down there, and I'd never been able to walk away from that sound. That choice. The choice to help instead of ignore. That's the choice that defined the next 38 years of my life. And I made it without even thinking, because that's who I was. At least, that's who I thought I was. I found him on the third day after the storm, when I was checking my property lines for damage. I heard it first. A low, rhythmic sound that wasn't quite human, not quite animal, coming from the steep ravine that marked my eastern boundary. Every instinct told me to walk away, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I'd spent years training people to respond to distress calls in the wilderness, and that sound was unmistakably a distress call. I grabbed rope and my medical kit and worked my way down the icy slope. At the bottom, wedged between two fallen trees and half buried in snow, I found something that made my brain simply stop working. A creature, massive, covered in dark brown hair, its left leg bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. And its eyes, God, those eyes were looking right at me with an expression I recognized instantly. Please help me. I stood there frozen, my hands gripping my medical kit so hard my fingers ached. The creature had to be over 8 feet tall, even lying down, broader across the shoulders than any human I'd ever seen. His chest rose and fell with labored breathing, frost forming around his mouth with each exhale. The smell hit me next, musky, wild, like wet dog mixed with something earthy I couldn't identify. But underneath that was the unmistakable copper scent of blood. His left leg was trapped under one of the massive trees, and even from 10 feet away I could see the bone jutting through the skin at an unnatural angle. The snow around him was stained pink. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. This wasn't possible. This thing didn't exist. I'd spent half my life in these mountains, and I'd never seen anything remotely like this. Bigfoot was a myth, a campfire story, something people claimed to see after too many beers, but here one was, dying not 20 feet from me, and every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to run, to get away, to pretend this wasn't happening. But I didn't run, because those eyes were still locked on mine, and there was intelligence there. Not animal awareness, but human-level intelligence. Understanding. He knew I was there. He knew I could help. And he was asking me, as clearly as if he'd spoken the words out loud, to make a choice about whether he lived or died. Jesus Christ, I whispered, my breath forming clouds in the frozen air. My mind was racing through options, none of them good. I could leave, hike back to the cabin, call the authorities. Game and wildlife, maybe, or the sheriff's department. Tell them I'd found something extraordinary. This would be the discovery of the century. Scientists would come from all over the world. My name would be in history books. I'd never have to worry about money again. But I also knew exactly what would happen to him if I made that call. He wouldn't be treated as a patient. He'd be treated as a specimen. They'd sedate him, transport him, keep him in some facility where researchers could study him. He'd spend the rest of his life in captivity, poked and prodded and analyzed, never free again. And looking into those eyes, seeing that very human expression of fear and pain and desperate hope, I knew I couldn't do that to him. Whatever he was a person. Not human maybe, but a person. And no person deserved that fate. I took a step closer, my boots crunching on the ice-crusted snow. He tensed, his massive body going rigid, and I saw his hands. They were hands, not paws with opposable thumbs and fingernails, dig into the frozen ground. He was preparing to defend himself if I turned out to be a threat. But he didn't growl or show aggression. He just watched, waiting to see what I'd do. I'm going to help you, I said quietly, Not sure if he could understand, but needing to say it anyway. But we have to do this my way, okay? And you have to trust me. I knelt down in the snow beside him, opened my medical kit with shaking hands, and made the choice that would define the rest of my life. I chose him over fame, over proof, over everything the world would have wanted me to do. I chose to see him as a person in need instead of a discovery to be exploited. And in that moment, kneeling beside an impossible creature in a frozen ravine, I became something I'd never imagined I'd be. A keeper of the world's biggest secret, bound by a promise I hadn't even spoken yet, but knew I'd keep until the day I died. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. Me standing there with my medical kit, completely inadequate for what I was looking at. Him trapped in the snow, dying, watching me with those impossibly intelligent eyes. I knew exactly what I should do. Get out of there. Call the authorities. Let scientists and government agencies handle this. This was the discovery of the century. Proof that Bigfoot existed. I'd be famous, rich. This would rewrite biology textbooks. But I also knew what would happen to him if I made that call. He'd be tranquilized, transported to some facility, studied, prodded, caged, turned into a specimen instead of whatever he actually was. And those eyes, they weren't the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of a person who was asking me, specifically me, to make a choice about his life. I thought about my bank account, perpetually hovering near empty. I thought about the survival school I was barely keeping afloat, the mortgage payments I stressed over every month. One phone call would solve all of that. One photograph would be worth more money than I'd see in 10 lifetimes. I actually reached for the camera in my pack, my fingers touching the cold metal of it. The creature saw the movement and tensed, his breathing becoming more rapid, steam rising from his mouth in quick bursts. He knew what a camera was. Somehow, he understood what it meant. "I'm not going to," I said, pulling my hand away from the camera. "I'm not going to do that to you." The words came out before I'd even fully decided, but the moment I said them, I knew they were true. I couldn't do it. I couldn't turn this thinking, feeling being into a circus attraction, no matter what it cost me personally. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my water bottle and took a long drink, trying to steady my nerves. The creature watched every movement, his dark eyes tracking me with an intensity that was unnerving. I knelt down in the snow closer to him, close enough now that I could see details I'd missed before. His face wasn't quite human, but wasn't quite ape either. Something in between, something that shouldn't exist according to everything science said was possible. His hands were massive but dexterous, the fingers long and capable. And his chest, I could see it rising and falling too rapidly, see the sheen of sweat despite the freezing temperature. He was going into shock. If I didn't act fast, the decision would be made for me. "Okay," I said, more to myself than to him. "Okay, I need to get you out of here. I need to get you somewhere I can actually help you. But I have no idea how to do that without killing both of us in the process." I stood up and walked around to assess the situation more carefully. The tree pinning his leg had to weigh several tons. I had rope, a come-along winch in my truck, and more determination than sense. But even if I got the tree off him, how was I going to move 600 pounds of injured creature up a 40-foot ravine and back to my barn? How was I going to do this without anyone seeing? My nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, but this time of year, people used snowmobiles to check on each other after bad storms. What if someone came by while I was trying to move him? The creature made a sound then, low and resonant, and somehow I understood it wasn't a growl or a threat. It was encouragement, like he was telling me he trusted me to figure it out, that he'd help however he could. That small gesture of faith from this impossible being made my decision feel less insane and more like the only choice I could live with. I looked up at the ravine I'd have to get him up, at the snow and ice that would make it nearly impossible, at the creature who would probably die if I failed. Then I looked at my watch. 2:47 p.m. I had maybe 4 hours of usable daylight left, and after that, the temperature would drop below zero. If I was going to do this, I had to do it now. "All right," I said, pulling my rope out and starting to formulate a plan that was probably going to get me killed. "Let's do this the stupid way." I'd like to say I felt certain about my choice, that I knew I was doing the right thing. But the truth is, I was terrified. Terrified of failing, of getting caught, of what would happen if this went wrong. I was committing myself to a path that meant lying to everyone I knew, keeping a secret that would isolate me from the entire world, and gambling that this creature wouldn't kill me the moment I got him free. But I'd already made my choice the moment I'd pulled my hand away from that camera. Everything else was just logistics. I'd chosen to see him as a person deserving of dignity and freedom, not as a specimen deserving of study. And that choice meant I was about to become something I'd never imagined: a criminal, a liar, and the only human being on earth who knew for certain that the impossible was real. Getting him up that ravine into my barn was the most physically demanding thing I'd ever done in my life. He was conscious, but weak, feverish, and had to weigh at least 600 pounds. It took me 5 hours, a block and tackle system, my truck, and every bit of strength I had. By the time I got him into the barn, I was shaking with exhaustion and the sheer insanity of what I was doing. I'd set the space up like a field hospital, tarps on the ground, my camping stove for heat, every medical supply I owned spread out on a workbench. I spent that first night setting his leg with techniques I'd learned in wilderness first aid courses, knowing I was completely out of my depth. I gave him water, antibiotics I'd bought for livestock, and prayed I wasn't about to watch this magnificent being die on my barn floor because I was too proud or too stupid to call for help. The barn smelled like wet animal, antiseptic, and my own fear sweat. I'd hung kerosene lanterns from the rafters, and they cast moving shadows that made everything feel surreal, like I was performing surgery in some frontier-era nightmare. The creature lay on his side on the tarps, his breathing rapid and shallow, his eyes half closed, but still tracking my movements. Every time I touched him, I felt the heat radiating from his body. The fever was bad, probably over 103 degrees, and I had no idea if that was even dangerous for his species or if they ran hotter than humans normally. I'd splinted compound fractures before, hikers who'd fallen, a hunting accident where a guy had shot himself in the leg. But never anything like this. His leg was massive, the bone thick as my wrist where it had broken through the skin. I cleaned the wound as best I could with hydrogen peroxide, and he made a sound that was definitely pain, a low rumble that I felt in my chest. But he didn't pull away. He didn't lash out. He just gripped the tarp with those enormous hands and let me work. "I'm sorry," I kept saying like a mantra. I'm sorry, I know this hurts." By 2 a.m., I had the bone set as well as I could manage, and the leg splinted with boards and duct tape. It looked ridiculous, completely inadequate, and I was certain I'd done it wrong. I'd given him a massive dose of antibiotics, 3 times what the bottle recommended for a 200-pound horse, figuring it was better to err on the side of too much than too little. He'd drunk nearly 2 gallons of water, which seemed like a good sign, and his breathing had slowed slightly, but the fever was still raging. I sat on an overturned bucket across from him, too exhausted to move, watching his chest rise and fall. The reality of what I'd done was starting to sink in. I had a Bigfoot in my barn, an actual, living, breathing Bigfoot. And I had no backup plan, no way to get real medical help if things went wrong, and no idea what I was going to do if someone came by my property in the next few weeks. How was I going to explain the barn being locked, the amount of food I'd need to buy to feed him, the fact that I'd suddenly become even more reclusive than usual? The creature opened his eyes then and looked directly at me. And for the first time since I'd found him, I saw something other than pain in that gaze. It was gratitude. Clear, unmistakable gratitude. He lifted one massive hand, the movement obviously costing him effort, and placed it over his chest, then extended it toward me, palm up. I had no idea what the gesture meant in his language, but I felt what it meant anyway. "Thank you. You saved my life." I felt tears burning in my eyes, exhaustion and emotion finally breaking through my adrenaline. "You're welcome," I whispered, "but you've got to survive this, okay? Because if you die after everything I just did, I'm going to feel really stupid." That got a reaction. The corners of his mouth turned up slightly, just barely. And I realized with a shock that he understood humor. Or at least, he understood the tone of what I was saying. He wasn't just intelligent. He was person intelligent. He had emotions, social understanding, the ability to read context and meaning beyond just words. I pulled his sleeping bag over to the tarp and lay down a few feet away from him, too tired to walk back to the cabin. As I drifted off, I thought about how my life had just changed in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I'd committed myself to keeping this secret, to protecting this being, to lying to everyone I knew for however long it took. I'd chosen his life over my own credibility, over wealth and fame, over everything that most people would have prioritized. And lying there in that cold barn, listening to his labored breathing gradually steady, I knew I'd make the same choice again. Because some things mattered more than being believed. Some things mattered more than proof. And saving a life, even an impossible life, was one of them. The first time he spoke to me, and I used that word deliberately, was on the 5th day. I'd just finished changing the dressing on his leg, and he'd been watching me work with the same intense focus he'd shown since I'd brought him here. Then he made a sound, low and resonant, and pointed to the water bucket with one massive hand. I handed it to him, and he made another sound, different pitch, different cadence, and placed his hand over his chest. It took me a moment to understand. He wasn't just making random vocalizations. He was trying to communicate, teaching me, showing me that he had language, thought, intention. I sat down hard on the barn floor, my hands shaking, because I just realized I wasn't treating an injured animal. I was treating an injured person who happened to be a different species entirely. "You're trying to teach me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're actually trying to teach me your language." He made the chest-touching sound again, then pointed at me and waited. I understood. He wanted me to try. My hands were trembling as I attempted to mimic the sound. It came out wrong, my throat not built for that deep resonance, but I tried. He tilted his head, made the sound again slower, and I tried to match it. On the 3rd attempt, I got close enough that he made a new sound, higher pitched, almost pleased, and nodded. "Yes, good. You're learning." Over the next few days, he taught me maybe a dozen sounds. Each one had a specific meaning: water, food, pain, good, bad, cold, warm. His vocal range was incredible, from deep chest rumbles that I felt more than heard to higher sounds that were almost musical. My attempts to reproduce them were clumsy at best, but he was patient, repeating each one until I got close enough for him to accept it. But it wasn't just his language he was teaching. He wanted to learn mine too. I'd point to objects and name them: bucket, bandage, light, and he'd repeat them back in his own way. His mouth couldn't quite form human consonants, but he'd approximate them, creating sounds that were recognizably attempts at English words. Bouquet, ban-ij, leaked. Each word took him multiple tries, and I could see the concentration on his face as he worked to shape sounds his vocal cords weren't designed for. "You're better at learning my language than I am at learning yours," I told him one evening, and he made a sound that I'd learned meant amusement. It was almost like a chuckle, a low rumbling that shook his chest. He was laughing at me, gently, and the humanity of that moment, the shared humor between two beings who shouldn't be able to communicate at all, hit me harder than anything else had. One night, about 2 weeks in, I was reading by lamplight after checking his bandages. He'd been watching me quietly, and then he reached out and gently touched the book with one massive finger. He made a questioning sound, one I'd learned meant, "What is this?" or "Explain this to me." "It's a book," I said, holding it up. "It's how humans store information. These symbols represent sounds, and the sounds make words, and the words tell stories." I had no idea if he understood any of that, but he was listening intently, his eyes moving between my face and the pages. Then I made a decision that felt significant in ways I didn't fully understand. I started reading out loud, just a few pages from the wilderness survival manual I'd been studying. And he listened. Not the way an animal might listen to a human voice, with vague interest or confusion. He listened the way a student listens to a teacher. His eyes tracked my face as I spoke, and every so often he'd make a small sound that I'd learned meant, "I understand," or "continue." When I finished the section, he placed his hand over his heart. The gesture I'd learned meant gratitude or acknowledgement, and then pointed to the book, then to me, then back to the book. He wanted me to keep reading. He wanted to learn, not just language, but knowledge. He wanted to understand the human world that had hurt him, but that I represented. I read to him for an hour that night, and it became our routine. Every evening, after I'd checked his wounds and brought food, I'd read. Sometimes survival manuals, sometimes the novels I kept in the cabin, sometimes just newspapers from town. And he'd listen, absorbing everything, occasionally asking questions through sounds and gestures that I was learning to interpret with increasing accuracy. Sitting in that barn, teaching and being taught by a being that science said didn't exist, I realized something profound. Language wasn't what made someone human. Communication, curiosity, the desire to understand and be understood, those were what mattered. And by those measures, the creature recovering in my barn was more human than a lot of people I'd met. He had a mind, a personality, emotions, and the capacity for learning that rivaled or exceeded my own. And I was the only human in the world who knew it. That knowledge was both a gift and a burden, heavier than I'd ever imagined carrying. Over the next 6 weeks, as his leg slowly healed, we developed something I can only call friendship. He taught me dozens of sounds that had specific meanings: food, water, pain, good, bad, danger. I taught him some English words, and he'd repeat them back in his own way, his vocal structure not quite built for human speech, but close enough that I could understand. We ate meals together, him going through enormous quantities of dried fish, nuts, and berries I'd stocked for winter, me watching in fascination as this impossible being sat across from me using tools, gesturing to communicate, showing gratitude and curiosity and humor. One evening in late February, I was reading by lamplight, and he reached over and touched the book gently, making a questioning sound. I realized he wanted to know what it was, what I was doing. So I started reading out loud, and this massive creature that science said didn't exist sat there listening to me read Jack London, his eyes tracking my face, completely absorbed in the story. We fell into routines that felt more natural than any human friendship I'd ever had. Every morning I'd bring breakfast, usually oatmeal for me, dried fish and nuts for him. And we'd eat together while the winter sun filtered through the gaps in the barn walls. He'd ask questions through sounds and gestures, and I'd answer as best I could. He wanted to know about everything: the tools on my workbench, the way the kerosene lamp worked, why I wore clothes when he didn't need them. His curiosity was boundless, childlike in its enthusiasm, but sophisticated in its understanding. I started calling him brother. I don't know why exactly. It just felt right. We weren't the same species, but we were connected in a way that transcended that. When I said the name, he'd make a specific sound back, and I understood that was his name for me in his language. A low, rumbling syllable that I couldn't quite reproduce, but that meant something like healer or friend, or maybe just the human who saved me. By mid-February, brother could walk around the barn, testing his weight on the healing leg. I'd watch him examine everything with those intelligent eyes, my carpentry tools, the old tractor parts I'd been meaning to fix, even the calendar hanging on the wall. One day, he picked up a hammer, hefted it thoughtfully, and then made a gesture asking if he could try using it. I handed him a nail and a piece of scrap wood and watched in amazement as he carefully, deliberately drove the nail in with 3 precise strikes. He wasn't just intelligent. He was capable of understanding and using human technology. "You're a quick learner," I said, and he made the sound that meant amusement, that chest-rumbling chuckle I'd come to love hearing. The evenings were my favorite time. After I'd checked his bandages and brought dinner, I'd read. We went through Call of the Wild, To Build a Fire, White Fang. London seemed appropriate for winter in the mountains, with a creature who understood wilderness better than any human. Brother would lean back against the barn wall, his eyes half closed, listening with the same intensity most people reserved for live music or prayer. Sometimes he'd make a sound when something in the story moved him: sadness when Buck's owner died, approval when the sled dog survived against the odds. One night, I wasn't reading. I was just talking, telling him about my life, about how I'd never quite fit in with people, how I'd always felt more at home in the forest than in towns, how I'd bought this land to get away from expectations and judgments, and the constant feeling that I was doing human interaction wrong. I've always been alone, I admitted, my voice quiet in the lamplight, and I told myself I preferred it that way. But the truth is I just never found anyone who understood me. I looked at Brother, at this impossible being who'd been listening to my rambling with patient attention. Until now. Isn't that crazy? The only real friend I've ever had isn't even human. Brother reached out and placed his massive hand on my shoulder. The gesture was gentle, careful, unmistakably meant as comfort, and I felt tears burning in my eyes because this creature understood loneliness. He understood what it meant to be different, to be isolated, to live in a world where you didn't quite belong. We were the same in that way, even if everything else about us was different. "Thank you," I whispered, "for trusting me, for letting me be your friend." He made a sound I hadn't heard before, soft, almost melodic, and pulled me into an embrace that was surprisingly gentle for someone who could have crushed my ribs without trying. We sat like that for a long moment, human and Bigfoot, two lonely beings who'd found unexpected connection in the most impossible circumstances. But even as I sat there feeling more accepted and understood than I'd ever felt with my own species, I knew this couldn't last. Brother's leg was almost healed. Soon he'd be strong enough to leave, to return to wherever he'd come from. And I'd be alone again. But this time, with the knowledge of what I'd lost. This time, I'd know exactly what real friendship felt like, and I'd have to spend the rest of my life pretending it had never existed. That thought terrified me more than anything else had. Because for 6 weeks in a freezing barn in the mountains, I'd found something I didn't know I needed, and I was about to lose it forever. By early March, his leg had healed enough that he could walk around the barn, testing his weight carefully. I knew what was coming. He'd be leaving soon, going back to wherever he'd come from, and I'd probably never see him again. And I realized I had a choice to make that was eating me alive. I had his hair on my clothes, his DNA on bandages I'd used. I could take samples, document everything, prove to the world that he existed. I'd spent 6 weeks with a Bigfoot in my barn, and I hadn't taken a single photograph. Every day I thought about it, just one picture, just one hair sample preserved properly. But every time I thought about reaching for my camera, I'd look at him and remember the trust in his eyes when he'd first let me touch his injured leg. He'd chosen to trust me with his life. How could I repay that by betraying him to a world that would see him as a specimen, not a person? The temptation was worst late at night when Brother was sleeping and I'd lie awake in my sleeping bag staring at the rafters. My camera sat in my cabin 50 yards away. It would take me 5 minutes to get it, maybe 30 seconds to snap a few photos. Evidence that would change everything. Proof that would validate every cryptozoologist who'd ever been laughed at, every witness who'd been dismissed as crazy or attention-seeking. I'd be vindicated, wealthy, famous. I'd never have to worry about money again, never have to scrape by teaching survival courses to tourists who half listened while checking their watches. One night, I actually got up. I made it to the barn door, my hand on the latch, fully intending to walk to the cabin and get the camera. Just one photo, that's all it would take. Brother wouldn't even know. He was sleeping deeply, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm I'd come to find comforting. But I couldn't make myself open that door, because I kept thinking about what would happen after I took that photo. The scientists who'd come, the government agencies, the media circus, and Brother, tranquilized and caged somewhere, being studied by people who'd never read Jack London to him, who'd never learned that his chest rumble meant amusement, who'd never see him as anything more than a fascinating biological specimen. I'd be the man who proved Bigfoot existed, and I'd also be the man who destroyed the life of the only real friend I'd ever had. Went back to my sleeping bag without opening the door. A few days later, I was cleaning up used bandages from Brother's last dressing change. There was hair on them, blood, DNA evidence that would be scientifically invaluable. I stood there, holding those bandages, looking at the trash bin where I always threw them, and then looking at the storage cabinet where I could preserve them instead. Brother was across the barn, examining a bird's nest that had fallen through a gap in the roof, completely absorbed in the delicate construction of twigs and grass. He looked up and caught me staring at the bandages in my hand. Our eyes met, and I saw him understand exactly what I was thinking about. He knew what those bandages represented. He knew I could keep them, use them, prove he existed. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then brother made a sound, not a word we'd established, but something new. A question. He was asking me what I was going to do, asking me to choose, right now, between evidence and trust. My hands were shaking as I walked to the trash bin and threw the bandages in. Then, I went to the storage cabinet, pulled out all the other used bandages I'd been accumulating, and threw those away too. Every piece of evidence, every sample. Gone. Brother made a sound I recognized, gratitude mixed with relief. He'd been worried. He'd known what I could do with that evidence, and he'd been afraid I'd do it. And in that moment, I realized how much courage it had taken for him to stay here, to trust me, knowing I held the power to destroy his entire world with one photograph. "I'm not going to do it," I told him, my voice rough with emotion. "I'm never going to do it. Your secret is safe with me. I promise." He crossed the barn in 3 strides and pulled me into an embrace that lifted me off my feet. And I hugged him back, this impossible being who'd taught me what friendship really meant, and I cried. Because I'd just chosen him over everything else, over wealth, over fame, over the validation I'd craved my entire life. I'd chosen to protect something precious over proving I was right, and that choice felt simultaneously like the easiest and hardest thing I'd ever done. When he finally set me down, I looked up at him and said, "When you leave, I'm going to miss you every single day, but I'll never tell anyone you were here. That's my promise to you." Brother placed his hand over his heart, then extended it to me. The gesture we'd established meant trust, agreement, a bond that couldn't be broken. And I knew, standing in that barn with evidence burning a hole in the trash bin and my camera gathering dust in the cabin, that I'd just committed myself to a lifetime of silence. I'd become the keeper of the world's greatest secret, and I'd chosen it willingly, because some things, some friendships, were worth more than being believed. March 15th, 1986. I woke up to find the barn door open and brother gone. He'd left without a sound sometime in the Shiud night, and I stood there in the cold dawn light feeling a grief I hadn't expected. I'd known he'd leave. I'd wanted him to leave, to go back to his life, to be free. But I'd also gotten used to his presence, to the quiet companionship we'd built. I went into the barn and found something that made my throat tight. He'd arranged stones on the workbench in a careful pattern, a circle with a line through it. I had no idea what it meant in his language, but I felt what it meant anyway. Goodbye. Thank you. I won't forget. I sat on that barn floor and cried like I hadn't cried since I was a kid, because I'd just lost the only friend who'd ever really understood me, and I could never tell anyone he'd existed. The barn felt cavernously empty without him. I could still smell his presence, that earthy, wild scent that had become so familiar over the past 6 weeks. The tarps where he'd slept still held the impression of his massive body. The water bucket he'd used sat by the workbench, and I couldn't bring myself to move it. It felt like disturbing a grave, erasing the last physical evidence that he'd been real, that any of this had actually happened. I picked up one of the stones from his goodbye message, turning it over in my hands. It was smooth river rock, probably from the creek that ran through my property. He must have collected these specifically for this purpose, planned this message while I'd been sleeping. The thought that he'd been so deliberate about saying goodbye, that he'd cared enough to leave me something, made the grief worse somehow. This wasn't just an animal leaving its rehabilitation site. This was a person saying farewell to a friend, knowing they'd probably never see each other again. I found his tracks in the snow outside, massive footprints heading northeast toward the deeper wilderness. I followed them for about a mile, telling myself I was just making sure he'd gotten away safely, that he wasn't struggling on the leg that had been so badly injured. But really, I was hoping maybe he'd stopped. Maybe he was waiting somewhere. Maybe this didn't have to be goodbye yet. The tracks were clean and steady, though, showing no signs of difficulty. He was healthy, strong. He didn't need me anymore. I turned back when the tracks led into terrain too rough to follow safely. Standing there in the forest, looking at the path he'd taken away from me, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Before brother, I'd chosen solitude. I'd preferred it. But now I knew what I'd been missing. Real connection, real understanding, the feeling of being accepted completely for who I was. And having experienced that, losing it was devastating in a way I hadn't been prepared for. The worst part was knowing I could never talk about this grief with anyone. If a friend moved away, you could tell people. You could process the loss, share memories, maybe even stay in touch. But brother? I couldn't tell a soul. I couldn't say, I had this incredible friend for 6 weeks and he's gone now, and I don't know if I'll ever see him again. I couldn't explain why I was suddenly so withdrawn, why I kept going out to the barn and just sitting there in the empty space. I couldn't share the stories we'd created together, the small jokes we'd developed, the way he'd listened to me read with such focused attention. I had to grieve in silence, and somehow that made it worse. I spent that entire day in the barn, cleaning up the space, removing all evidence that anything unusual had happened there. I burned the remaining tarps, sanitized the workbench, put my tools back in their proper places. By evening, it looked like it always had, just a workshop and storage space, nothing remarkable about it at all. You'd never know that for 6 weeks, this barn had housed something impossible, that it had been the site of the most meaningful friendship of my life. But I kept the stone, the one from his goodbye message. I put it in my pocket, and I've carried it with me every day since. A secret reminder that it was real, that he was real, that for a brief time, I'd been trusted by something extraordinary. And every time I touch that smooth stone, I remember what it meant. Not just goodbye, but thank you for seeing me as a person. Thank you for keeping me safe. Thank you for choosing friendship over proof. I walked back to my cabin that night knowing my life had permanently changed. I'd tasted connection and lost it. I'd been given a gift I could never speak of, and I'd spend the rest of my life carrying this secret, this grief, and this strange gratitude all at once. Grateful for what I'd experienced, grieving for what I'd lost, and terrified that I'd never feel that understood again. The loneliest part wasn't that brother was gone. It was knowing that the most important thing that had ever happened to me would have to stay buried forever. A secret so big it would separate me from every other human relationship I'd ever try to build. Within a week, the rumors started. My nearest neighbor, old Bill Hutchins, who lived 3 miles down the mountain, mentioned he'd seen tracks on his property he couldn't identify. Someone in town claimed they'd heard strange vocalizations in the forest. A hiker reported seeing a large dark shape moving through the trees. And I lied. To everyone. I dismissed it all as bear sightings, elk calls, shadows, and wishful thinking. I became the voice of skepticism, the practical survivalist who rolled his eyes at Bigfoot stories. When a researcher from the university came through asking questions, I sent him 20 miles in the wrong direction. When a local hunting guide started getting close to the truth, I spread rumors that he was a drunk and a liar. I became someone I didn't recognize, calculating, deceptive, willing to destroy other people's credibility to protect a secret that was eating me alive. The first time I really crossed a line was with Tom Martinez, a hunting guide who'd been working these mountains for 20 years. We were at the general store in town, and he was showing people plaster casts of tracks he'd found near his property, tracks that were unmistakably brothers. The prints were clear, detailed, showing the dermal ridges that proved they weren't fakes. Tom was excited, almost childlike in his enthusiasm, pointing out the details to anyone who'd listen. "Look at the stride length," he said, measuring between the prints. "Whatever made these had to be over 8 feet tall. And see here? These are fresh, maybe 3 days old. I'm telling you, there's something out there." Everyone in the store was gathered around, and I saw belief starting to form on their faces. Someone mentioned calling the news. Another person suggested contacting a Bigfoot research group, and I felt panic rising in my chest because this was it. This was how it started. One credible witness, one piece of good evidence, and suddenly people would be flooding into these mountains looking for brother. "Tom," I said, keeping my voice casual, friendly even, "I hate to tell you this, but I saw Jim Henderson practicing for that Bigfoot prank he's been planning. He showed me these exact fake feet he carved, said he was going to leave tracks all over the valley as an April Fool's joke." The lie came out so smoothly it scared me. Tom's face fell. "What? Are you sure?" Positive. I told him it was a stupid idea, but you know Jim. He thought it would be funny. There was no prank. Jim Henderson wasn't planning anything, but I said it with such conviction that I watched doubt creep into Tom's expression, watched his excitement drain away like water from a broken glass. "Son of a bitch," Tom muttered, looking at his casts. "I can't believe I fell for it." The group dispersed, laughing about Jim's prank, about how they'd almost been fooled. And Tom packed up his casts, his shoulders slumped, his enthusiasm completely destroyed. I'd just killed something precious in him, that wonder, that excitement of believing he'd found something extraordinary. And I felt sick about it, but I told myself it was necessary. I'd protected brother. That's what mattered. But it got worse. A graduate student from Washington State University came through a month later, doing research on wildlife patterns. Her name was Jennifer, and she was smart, methodical, asking questions about animal behavior that showed she actually knew what she was talking about. Over coffee, she mentioned strange findings in her camera trap data. "3 of my cameras caught something unusual," she said, pulling out photos. "The footage is corrupted somehow, but the thermal signature is wrong for any known animal in this region. Too big, too bipedal. I'm thinking of expanding my study area." I looked at the photos. The images were blurry, but I could make out enough to recognize brother's general shape. My coffee suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth. "Where exactly are these cameras?" I asked. She showed me, on a map, right along brother's probable travel route heading northeast. If she put more cameras up, if she started intensive monitoring of that area, it was only a matter of time before she got clear footage. "Honestly," I said, putting on my most professional voice, "I'd focus your resources elsewhere. That area is mostly game trails used by seasonal elk migration. If you want interesting data on unusual wildlife behavior, there's a section about 15 miles west where I've been seeing some really anomalous predator activity. That's where I'd put cameras if I were you." I spent the next 20 minutes giving her detailed information about a completely different area, selling the lie with genuine expertise, watching her take notes and thank me for the advice. She left excited about this new direction for her research, completely diverted from the truth. And I sat in that coffee shop feeling like I'd just committed a crime. Because that's what I was doing, wasn't it? Sabotaging legitimate research, destroying people's credibility, actively working against scientific discovery. Every principle I'd ever claimed to value, honesty, integrity, the pursuit of knowledge, I was violating them all. And for what? To protect a creature who'd already left, who might not even be in the area anymore, who I'd probably never see again anyway. But I knew I'd keep doing it. I'd keep lying, keep misdirecting, keep destroying evidence and credibility into other people's dreams of discovery. Because somewhere out there, brother was alive and free because I'd made a promise. And that promise meant more to me than my own integrity, even if keeping it was turning me into someone I barely recognized when I looked in the mirror. The worst part was how easy it became. Each lie came smoother than the last. I developed a whole arsenal of deflections, dismissals, and misdirections. I became known as the local expert who could explain away any Bigfoot report with logical, reasonable alternative explanations. People trusted me, and I used that trust to protect a secret that was costing me pieces of my soul with every word I spoke. I met Sarah in the fall of 1987 at an outdoor equipment expo in Seattle where I was teaching a survival skills workshop. She was a wildlife photographer, funny and smart, and completely comfortable in the wilderness. We fell in love fast, got married in 1989, and for a few years I thought maybe I could be normal. Maybe I could build a regular life and just forget about what had happened. We had a son in 1991. We built a good life together. But the secret was always there, sitting between us like a wall I couldn't cross. She'd ask me why I was so protective of certain areas of our property, why I got tense when researchers came around, why I'd disappear into the woods for hours sometimes just to stand in the places where I remembered brother and wonder if he was still alive somewhere, still safe, still free. Sarah was everything I should have wanted. She loved the mountains as much as I did, could start a fire in the rain, could navigate by stars and animal tracks. Our first date was a 3-day backpacking trip into the Cascades, and I remember thinking this is someone who gets it. who understands why wilderness matters. When I proposed to her on a ridge overlooking the valley where my property sat, she cried and said yes, and I felt hope for the first time since brother had left. Hope that maybe I could have a normal life after all. Our wedding was small, just family and a few friends, held right there on my property in the summer of 1989. And standing there saying my vows, promising to share everything with her, to have no secrets between us, I felt the weight of the lie I was already living settle more heavily on my shoulders. Because I was promising something I knew I couldn't give. There would always be one secret, one massive thing I could never share, no matter how much I loved her. The first year was good. We were happy. She set up a darkroom in the cabin for her photography work, and I expanded the survival school. We'd spend evenings planning trips, discussing wilderness conservation, dreaming about the future. But there were moments when I'd catch her watching me with this puzzled expression, like she couldn't quite figure something out. "You ever notice how you get weird about the northeast section of the property?" she asked one night in 1990. We were in bed, her head on my chest, and I felt my whole body tense at the question. "Like, you never want to take groups up there. You always steer people away from it. Why is that?" "Just rough terrain," I said, the lie smooth and practiced. "Not safe for beginners." "I've been up there. It's not that rough." She lifted her head to look at me. "What's really going on?" I wanted to tell her. God, I wanted to tell her so badly. I wanted to share the most important thing that had ever happened to me with the person I loved most, but I couldn't. So I kissed her forehead and said, "I'm just protective of the land, that's all. Want to keep some of it pristine." I felt her withdraw slightly, not physically but emotionally. That tiny distance that appears when someone knows you're not being completely honest. When our son Jake was born in 1991, I thought maybe that would fix things. Maybe becoming a father would give me something bigger to focus on, something that would matter more than the secret. And Jake did matter. Holding him for the first time, feeling the weight of this tiny person who depended on me completely, I felt a love so intense it was almost painful. But it didn't erase brother. It just added another layer of complexity, another person I was lying to by omission. Sarah wanted to move closer to town when Jake was 3. "Better schools," she said. "More social opportunities for him. A more normal childhood than growing up isolated on a mountain." And I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave the property because what if brother came back? What if he needed help again and I wasn't here? I made excuses, the business, the land, our lifestyle. But Sarah heard what I wasn't saying. I was choosing the property over her needs, over our son's needs. "What are you protecting?" she asked me one night in 1994 after another argument about moving. "It's like you're guarding something out here, like you're waiting for something. What is it?" "Nothing," I said, and watched her face close off a little more. Another brick in the wall between us. The worst was when she found the stone. Brother's goodbye stone that I kept in my pocket, that I'd touch unconsciously when I was thinking about him. She pulled it out of my jeans when doing laundry one day and asked about it. "Just a rock," I said. "You carry it every single day. I've noticed. What does it mean?" "It's just a reminder of something important." "What?" "Just something personal from before we met." She set the stone down on the counter and looked at me with such hurt in her eyes. "You have all these secrets, these locked rooms in your head I can't access. How am I supposed to build a life with someone who won't let me all the way in?" I had no answer. Because she was right. I had locked rooms and she was standing outside them, and no matter how much I loved her, I couldn't give her the key. The secret was bigger than my marriage, bigger than my own happiness. It had to be. Because if I told her, if I told anyone, I'd be betraying the trust brother had placed in me. And I'd already decided that trust was sacred, that it mattered more than anything else. But standing there watching Sarah realize I'd never be fully honest with her, watching the hope drain out of her face, I understood what my choice was costing me. I was losing the woman I loved because I was protecting something that might not even exist anymore, something I hadn't seen in 8 years. And the terrible thing was, I'd make the same choice again. The secret had to stay secret, even if it meant losing everything else. By 1995, Sarah knew something was wrong. She'd ask me what I was hiding, and I'd lie. I'd tell her it was just stress, just old memories from before we met, just my natural tendency toward solitude. The lies accumulated like poison. She started talking about moving closer to civilization, selling the property, giving our son a more normal childhood. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave the land because some part of me was still waiting, still hoping that brother might come back. And if he did, I needed to be here. Sarah finally left in 1997, taking our 6-year-old son with her. She didn't understand why I was choosing 200 acres of forest over my own family. How could she? How could I explain that I'd made a promise to a being that the world didn't believe existed, and that promise meant more to me than my own happiness? The breaking point came on a Tuesday in October. Sarah had found me in the barn again. I'd been spending more and more time there, just sitting in the space where brother had recovered, like being there would somehow bring him back, or at least make me feel less alone. She stood in the doorway, Jake on her hip, and I saw 8 years of frustration and hurt finally crystallizing into something harder. "Who was it?" she asked quietly. "What?" "Whoever you're waiting for, whoever you're protecting. There's someone, isn't there? Someone from your past that you can't let go of." Her voice cracked. "Is it a woman? Is that what this is?" I actually laughed, a bitter sound that made her flinch. "No, Sarah, it's not." "Then what?" "Because I've tried everything. I've been patient. I've given you space. I've built my entire life around your inexplicable need to stay on this exact piece of land. And you won't tell me why. You won't let me in." Jake started crying, picking up on his mother's distress. "Our son deserves better than this. I deserve better than this." I stood up, wanting to go to her, but she stepped back. "You're right," I said. "You do deserve better, but I can't. I made a promise a long time ago, and I have to keep it." "A promise to who?" Her voice rose. "Who is so important that you'd sacrifice your marriage, your family? Tell me, give me something." I opened my mouth, and for one wild second, I almost told her everything. About the storm, the ravine, brother lying there dying, the 6 weeks we'd spent together, the friendship that had changed my entire understanding of the world. But I couldn't. The words literally wouldn't come out. Because telling her meant risking brother, risking his people, risking everything I'd protected for 11 years. "I can't," I whispered. "I'm sorry, but I can't tell you." Sarah's face did something I'd never seen before. It went completely blank, like a door closing. "Then we're done. I'm done begging you to choose us. I'm done competing with whatever ghost you're keeping." She left the barn, and I heard her start packing in the cabin. I sat back down on the floor where brother had once slept and put my head in my hands. I could stop this. All I had to do was tell her the truth, show her that I wasn't keeping some sordid secret, that I was protecting something important and beautiful and impossible. But if I told her, she'd want proof. She'd want to document it, maybe tell someone, maybe just take one photo to share with me in the privacy of our marriage. And I couldn't risk it. One photo could lead to exposure, to discovery, to everything I'd sworn to prevent. So I let her pack. I let her load Jake into the car with his toys and his clothes and his confusion about why Daddy wasn't coming. I let her drive away down the mountain while our son cried in his car seat, reaching for me through the rear window. The silence after they left was absolute. I sat on the porch of the cabin, our cabin, the one we'd made into a home together, and tried to understand what I'd just done. I'd chosen a creature I hadn't seen in over a decade over the woman I loved and the child we'd created together. I'd chosen a promise made to someone who might be dead, might be hundreds of miles away, might not even remember me. I'd chosen a secret over a family. And the worst part? I knew I'd do it again, because the alternative, breaking my word, potentially exposing brother's people, becoming the kind of person who'd trade trust for personal happiness, felt worse than losing everything. The secret had become more important than my own life. It had become my entire identity. I wasn't a husband or a father or a survival instructor anymore. I was the keeper of the secret. That's all I was. That's all I'd let myself be. I went into the barn that night and looked at the stone brother had left me, still in my pocket after all these years. "I hope you're worth it," I said out loud to the empty air. "I hope you're out there living your life safe and free, because I just destroyed mine to protect you." But even as I said it, I knew the truth. It wasn't Brother's fault. He hadn't asked me to sacrifice my marriage. He hadn't demanded that I keep the secret at all costs. I'd made that choice myself. I'd let the secret consume me, let it become more important than the actual living people in my life who needed me. I'd turned a beautiful act of friendship and protection into an obsession that had isolated me completely. Sarah filed for divorce in early 1998. The papers cited irreconcilable differences, which was technically true. She got primary custody of Jake, and I got supervised visitation twice a month until I could demonstrate emotional stability. I signed everything without contest. What was I going to say? That I was perfectly stable, I was just protecting Bigfoot? That would get me evaluated, probably medicated, definitely stripped of any custody rights at all. So I became a divorced man living alone on a mountain, protecting something that might not even exist anymore, having sacrificed everything real for something impossible. And I had no one to blame but myself. From 1997 to 2017, I lived alone on the property. My son would visit sometimes, awkward weekends where he clearly wished he was anywhere else, and then those visits stopped too. I kept teaching survival courses, kept guiding hunts, kept living my half-life. But I was also watching, always watching. I learned to read the forest the way Brother might, looking for signs that his people moved through these mountains. Occasionally, I'd find things, structures made from broken trees, carefully arranged rocks, areas where large things had bedded down in ways that didn't match any known animal. I never investigated too closely. I just noted them, cataloged them in my mind, and felt a strange comfort knowing I wasn't completely alone. That somewhere out there, Brother's people still existed, still survived, still moved through a world that didn't believe in them. Jake's last visit was in 2003 when he was 12. Sarah had remarried by then to a dentist in Bellingham who coached Little League and attended PTA meetings and did all the normal father things I'd never done. Jake spent that weekend on his phone, texting his friends, clearly counting the hours until he could leave. On Sunday morning, I tried one last time. "Want to take a hike? I could show you some tracking techniques, teach you how to read animal signs." It was a desperate attempt to connect with him through the one thing I was good at. "Not really," he said, not even looking up from his screen. "Dad, why do you live like this? Mom says you're, I don't know, stuck or something. Why can't you just be normal?" I had no answer he'd understand. How could I explain that I was keeping watch, maintaining a vigil, protecting something he'd never believe existed? So I just said, "This is who I am, Jake. I'm sorry if that's not enough." He left that afternoon, and I haven't seen him since. He's 33 now, married with kids of his own that I've never met. Sarah sends Christmas cards sometimes with family photos, and I study them like artifacts from a life I could have had if I'd made different choices. But the signs kept me going. In 2001, I found a structure about 3 miles northeast of my property. Trees bent and woven together in a way that no natural force could create, forming a kind of shelter or marker. My hands shook as I examined it, recognizing the deliberate intelligence behind the construction. Someone had made this. Someone like Brother. I didn't disturb it, didn't take photos. I just memorized the location and checked on it periodically. It stayed there for 2 years before weather finally brought it down. In 2005, I found footprints near the creek that ran through my property. They were old, mostly washed out by rain, but the size and spacing were unmistakable. I knelt beside them, placing my hand in one of the impressions, and felt tears running down my face. Brother had been here, or someone like him. They'd walked within a quarter mile of my cabin, close enough that I could have seen them if I'd been looking at the right moment. I'd missed them by days, maybe hours. From 1997 to 2017, I lived alone on the property. Jake stopped visiting. I kept teaching survival courses, kept living my half-life. But I was always watching, looking for signs that Brother's people still moved through these mountains. I found things, structures made from broken trees, carefully arranged rocks, areas where large things had bedded down. I never investigated too closely. I just cataloged them in my mind and felt a strange comfort knowing I wasn't completely alone. By 2010, I documented 17 possible signs. Not proof, never proof, but indicators. The locations became a mental map I'd walk obsessively, checking and rechecking. Sometimes I'd talk to the forest like brother could hear me. "Are you out there? Do you remember me?" Standing alone in the dark, hoping some impossible creature might somehow know I was still here, still keeping my promise. In 2015, I turned 55 and realized I'd spent more of my life keeping this secret than I'd spent before finding brother. My knees ached, my back hurt constantly. I had no retirement savings because I'd spent every spare dollar buying up land parcels to create a buffer zone. I had no wife, no relationship with my son, no real friends. I lived in a cabin that needed repairs I couldn't afford. And for what? For signs that might be nothing. For a creature I hadn't seen in nearly 30 years. But then, in spring 2016, I found something that changed everything. A rock arrangement on my property, just outside the barn. 5 stones in a circle with a line through it, the same pattern brother had left when he'd said goodbye. But this one had something additional, a smaller circle beside it, like an echo. I stood there staring, my heart pounding. This was a message meant for me specifically. I'm still here. I remember. You're not forgotten. I sat down in the dirt and cried. For 20 years, I'd been wondering if I'd destroyed my life for nothing. And now I knew it hadn't been for nothing. Someone out there remembered. The world closing in. By 2015, things were changing. Trail cameras everywhere, drones with thermal imaging, smartphones documenting every moment. The wilderness was shrinking, and I started having nightmares about brother's people being discovered by someone who wouldn't protect them. I used what money I had to buy adjacent parcels. I filed false reports about endangered species to get sections closed to development. I became obsessed, paranoid. The breaking point came in 2017 when a tech company announced they were installing motion-activated cameras throughout the Cascades. AI recognition software that could distinguish between species, alert rangers to unusual activity. I attended the public meeting, panic rising in my chest. Wildlife corridors, exactly where brother's people would need to travel. Over the next months, I did things I'm not proud of. I destroyed equipment, spread rumors, contacted environmental groups. The project got delayed, scaled back. But I was just buying time. The worst was 2018. A hobbyist's thermal imaging drone caught something unusual, a large bipedal heat signature. The video went viral. Within days, dozens of people were searching the area. I joined them to sabotage, placed false tracks, staged evidence, watched their excitement turn to disappointment as they left convinced it was nothing. But my hands shook the entire time, because that thermal signature had been real. How much longer could I keep doing this? Jake called in December 2018. "Dad, are you okay? You don't sound good." "I can't leave, Jake. I have responsibilities here." "Responsibilities to what?" "Dad, there's nothing up there that's more important than your own health." But he was wrong. There was something more important, or I just couldn't tell him. After we hung up, I faced the truth. I was 58. My body was breaking down. Who would protect brother's people after I was gone? I'd never built a succession plan. The protection died with me. I was fighting a losing battle. Eventually, I'd fail. Eventually, someone would get proof I couldn't explain away. That realization should have broken me. Instead, it made me more determined. I'd keep my promise until my last breath, even if I had to burn my life to ashes to do it. He came back November 3rd, 2024. I was 64, sitting in my cabin when the motion sensor went off. I grabbed my flashlight and walked into the cold night. The barn door was open, and there, standing in the darkness, I saw him. Older now, graying at the shoulders, but unmistakably him. Brother. After 38 years, and the expression on his face was desperation. "Brother?" The word came out as barely a whisper. He made a sound I remembered, my name in his language. Then he stepped into the light, and I saw he was limping, the leg I'd set all those years ago. I moved toward him, and when we embraced, I felt tears streaming down my face. He was real. He'd come back. But the reunion lasted only seconds before he pulled back and made an urgent sound. He turned toward the darkness and called out. From the shadows, another figure emerged. A female. Smaller than Brother, her reddish-brown hair matted, moving with obvious difficulty. I could hear the labored wheeze of her breathing. She was dying. Brother had brought her because he remembered I'd saved him once. He was asking me to save her now. "Oh God, Brother, what happened?" "Days," he communicated. She'd been sick for days. I helped them into the barn. The female, I'd call her Shadow, collapsed onto the same spot where Brother had recovered 38 years ago. I knelt beside her, hands shaking. Pneumonia, maybe worse. This wasn't something I could fix with wilderness first aid. This needed real medicine, real medical intervention. "Brother, I don't know if I can do this. She needs more than I can give her." He made a sound of grief mixed with pleading. "Try. Please try. You're all we have." I thought about Marcus, my friend, a retired veterinarian, but bringing in anyone else meant breaking 38 years of secrecy. Shadow made a terrible gasping sound, and Brother cried out in anguish. "I need to make a phone call," I said quietly. "But Brother, if I bring someone else here, everything changes. The secret won't be just mine anymore." Brother looked at Shadow, dying, then back at me. Hand over his heart, extended toward me. "Trust. Do what you have to do." For 38 years, I'd protected this secret absolutely. And now I was about to break it because watching Shadow die was something I couldn't live with. The impossible choice. I spent 3 days trying to help her with everything I had, but she was getting worse. Brother sat with her constantly, making soft sounds, touching her face with such tenderness it broke my heart. On the third night, Shadow had a seizure. Brother made a sound of pure anguish. When it stopped, Shadow lay there barely conscious, her breathing so shallow I had to watch carefully to see if her chest was moving. Brother was shaking, trembling with fear and exhaustion. He hadn't slept in 3 days. "Brother, we need to talk." He knew what I was going to say. He'd been watching me fail. "I can't do this alone. I know someone. Marcus, he was a veterinarian. He might be able to save her." Brother made a questioning sound. "But it means telling him about you. Once I do that, I can't take it back. The secret gets bigger, more dangerous." Brother looked at Shadow's failing body, then back at me. "Trust, fear, but trust stronger than fear. You want me to call him, even knowing the risk?" Brother placed one hand on Shadow's chest, feeling her weak heartbeat, then placed his other hand over his own heart. He was asking, "What would you do if this was someone you loved?" I thought about Sarah, how I'd chosen the secret over her, over my marriage. I'd lived with that choice for 27 years, telling myself it was right. But looking at Brother holding his dying mate, I realized something. I'd been wrong. The secret wasn't more important than love. "Okay, I'll call him." Brother took both my hands and pressed them to his chest, then to Shadow's chest. The contrast was stark. He was alive. She was dying. Her life was worth any risk. I pressed call. As the phone rang, I felt 38 years of secrecy shatter. Brother had chosen love over fear, hope over certainty, the way I should have years ago. "Marcus," I made the call at 3 a.m. on November 6th. I told Marcus the truth, all of it. The rescue in 1986, Brother's return, the dying female in my barn. Marcus didn't hang up or call me crazy. He just said, "I'll be there in 2 hours." When Marcus's truck pulled up at 5:15 a.m., I met him outside. "Before we go in, you cannot tell anyone, ever. Not your wife, not anyone." "Are you serious? Or do you need me to take you to a hospital?" "I'm completely serious. When you see them, don't panic. They're people, not animals, people." I opened the barn door. Brother stood up to his full height, over 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair graying at the shoulders. Marcus's cases hit the ground. Jesus Christ, it's real. "We don't have time for shock. She's dying. Can you help?" Marcus stared, then something shifted. Training kicked in. "Where's the patient?" For 6 hours we worked. Marcus set up an IV, administered antibiotics, gave her oxygen. Brother watched everything, understanding these humans were trying to help. Around hour 3, Marcus talked to Shadow like any patient. "You're doing good, girl. Hang in there." He'd crossed the same line I'd crossed 38 years ago, seeing her as a person who needed help. At dawn, Shadow's breathing changed, the rattling wheeze replaced by clearer breaths. Her fever had broken. Marcus looked up with tears in his eyes. "She's going to make it." Brother moved to Shadow's side. She opened her eyes, really opened them, and looked at him, made a weak sound. Brother's whole body shook with sobs. Marcus and I stepped outside. 38 years, Marcus said. "You've known about this for 38 years. I made a promise to protect them. You divorced Sarah over this, lost your son, spent your whole life alone, all to protect them. And now I've brought you into it, made you a keeper of secrets. I'm sorry." He was quiet, watching the sun rise. "Don't apologize. What I just saw, that's the most important thing I'll ever be part of." Brother appeared. He placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder and made the gratitude sound. Then he touched his own chest and made a new sound, one I'd never heard. "I think he just gave you a name, in his language. You're someone he'll remember." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "I'll keep your secret. I swear it. For the rest of my life." We stood there as the sun climbed higher. The burden was shared now, two humans keeping the secret. But I also felt fear. Secrets that get shared have a way of spreading. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. I looked at Brother, at the barn where Shadow was recovering. "Now we figure out how to keep them safe in a world that's running out of places to hide." Brother made a sound. Some risks were worth taking. That trust sometimes meant choosing to believe in others, even when every instinct screamed to stay hidden. I'd spent 38 years protecting them through silence. But maybe protection meant something different. Maybe it meant expanding the circle of trust, carefully, deliberately. Or maybe I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. But standing there in the morning light, I felt something I hadn't felt in 38 years. Hope. Terrifying, dangerous, beautiful hope.